What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT, man. I am so excited for the college football season and NFL seasons to kick off, man. This is the most excited that I've ever been for the upcoming college football and NFL seasons, man. And on today's episode, it's going to be a little college football heavy because I'm just going to keep it 100 with you guys. I'm getting a little bit burnt out talking about the NFL. Keeping up with training camp and the preseason is a lot. So I wanted to talk a little more college football today. We still have some NFL topics to discuss. We're going to talk about Commanders players voicing their concerns about Eric Bieniemy's intensity. Does college football have a great game shortage? Florida versus Utah, going to give you guys my early thoughts and why I believe that this program is going to be the second best team in the SEC East this year. Not going to reveal who. You're going to have to listen to the whole entire show to find out who I think is going to be the second best team in the SEC East behind Georgia this year. Before we start, if you haven't already, make sure that you listen to the audio version of the JT Sports Podcast. We're not just available on YouTube. You can find us on all podcasting platforms: Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. You can find the JT Sports Podcast. Please rate us 5 stars. We're trying to get to 100 5-star reviews on Apple and Spotify before the starts of the NFL and college football season. So go ahead, if you enjoy the podcast and you want to support the channel, rate us 5 stars. All you got to do is go to whichever podcasting service that you use, Apple or Spotify, type in the JT Sports Podcast and it will pop up. Or you can go down to the link down in the description. Scroll down a little bit, and there will be the links to the Apple and Spotify versions of the podcast. And lastly, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. We go live every day, Monday through Friday, around 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Turn on post notifications so you don't miss whenever we go live. I'm a big believer in the Washington Commanders going into this season. I have this team penciled in as my biggest sleeper team going into this year. I think they're capable of being able to go 9-8 and clinching the last playoff spot in the NFC. And a large reason why I have so much optimism about the Commanders is because they hired Eric Bieniemy to be their new offensive coordinator. And I was wondering when the national media was going to start paying attention to the Commanders, and they have. And one of the biggest things is that I had a number of guys come to me and said, hey, just go talk to him. I said, understand what he's trying to get across to you. I think as they go and they talk and they listen to him, it's been enlightening for a lot of these guys. I mean, it's a whole different approach. Again, you're getting a different kind of player from the players back in the past, especially in the light of how things are coming out of the college football. So a lot of these young guys, they do struggle with certain things, and a lot of it is from where they've been. I mean, guys are coming from certain programs are used to it. Guys coming from other programs aren't as much. So us as coaches, I kind of have to assimilate and get a feel for everybody. Eric has had an approach, and it's the way he does things, and it's not going to change because he believes it. Jack Del Rio has his approach. Having been a head coach, I think Jack has a tendency to try to figure guys out a little bit more as opposed to, hey, this is it, this is the way it's going to be, that type of stuff. Eric hasn't had that experience yet. When they came to you, is it just they felt like Eric was riding them too hard? And Ron Rivera said, well, they just were a little concerned. Now, my thoughts on this is that these players, I don't think that they are overly concerned about Eric Bieniemy's coaching style. You guys have to remember that most of these guys in the NFL have been playing football for their whole entire lives, going from pee-wee football, middle school, high school, college, NFL. Eventually, at one point, you get one of those tough coaches. And Anybody who ever played football knows about the coaches that get in your face, that like to yell at you a lot. You ever played a game and you was on the defense side of football and you had your head coach screaming at you, move over, 11 or whatever your number was? Sometimes you just have coaches that just do a lot of yelling and that are really intense. And Eric Bieniemy is one of those guys, and that's why I think this was a fantastic hire by Ron Rivera. You see, this franchise has been lacking discipline. And obviously we've seen how the Commanders were in all the years under Dan Snyder when he was the owner. Eric Bieniemy is going to bring a sense of urgency, a sense of discipline, which is what this organization needs. What the Commanders have been lacking for all these years has been structure. Eric Bieniemy is all about structure, and this is somebody that knows what it takes to be a winning organization. He was with the Kansas City Chiefs for several years and won 2 Super Bowls with that organization. So this is somebody that has seen what it takes to build a championship culture in a championship winning organization. And with Ron Rivera, he hasn't really had that kind of success over the last couple of years as a head coach that makes you feel insanely confident that the Commanders are going to have success this year. If the Commanders make it to the playoffs, I believe it's solely going to be because of Eric Bieniemy and how good this offense is going to be. Now, this defense should be as good as what it always has been under Ron Rivera, but the offense is the difference between the Washington Commanders being 8-1 last season and being a 9-8 team or better. Eric Bieniemy, to get this offense playing up to the potential that it could play at, he needs these players to be bought in. And his coaching style, being a little bit intense, being a little bit hard on players, I think is what the Washington Commanders need. And as long as this offense is having success and this team is winning games, this isn't going to be a problem. You see, Bill Belichick is the same way. There are plenty of other coaches who are the same way. The only time this begins to cause issues in the locker room is when you start to lose. And for the players that are going to Ron Rivera complaining about it, I say toughen up a little bit. And what's weird is that more statements have come out over the last couple of hours about Ron Rivera kind of recanting his statements from the other day when he made those quotes about Eric Bieniemy and players voicing a little bit of concern about how hard he comes at them as coaches, or players or whatever. But my thing is that for Ron Rivera, why would you even air that out anyway? I don't really think that's something that the media needed to know. And I don't think that Ron Rivera is worried about his head coaching job getting taken away and him getting replaced by Eric Bieniemy, because if this doesn't work out, I don't think that Eric Bieniemy is going to become the next head coach, because why would you hire somebody who was part of a losing team? I think with a new ownership, they rather just go in a completely different direction and hire their own guy who they choose to bring in. But Ron Rivera needs Eric Bieniemy to work out. And I think that Ron Rivera has a good understanding of what Eric Bieniemy is all about. There have been former players such as Tyreek Hill who have voiced their support for Eric Bieniemy's coaching style, and there have been players such as LaShawn McCoy who have voiced a lot of displeasure with Eric Bieniemy and how he goes about coaching up his players. But when you have a coach like Eric Bieniemy that's hard-nosed, a little old school about discipline, holding guys accountable, guys like LaShawn McCoy are probably going to be a little turned off to that. Not every player likes these kinds of coaches, which is why it's important that you're able to win if you have a guy like Eric Bieniemy on your staff as a coach, because sometimes you can have a coach that's a little too intense, and when things end up going wrong, you can end up losing the locker room. There has to be a little bit of balance when it comes to how hard you go at certain players, because being a head coach isn't just about X's and O's. It's also about knowing your players and knowing how they respond to certain situations and talking to them and communicate them in a way that is able to get them to elevate their play. Why do you think that the Steelers have been able to overachieve over the last couple of years under Mike Tomlin? Because he understands how to motivate his players. He knows how to talk to his players in a way that they respond in a positive way on the field. Eric Bieniemy, with his coaching style, is kind of his way or the hard way. And that may not get the most out of every single guy on the team, but for the guys who do buy in, those are probably going to be the best players on this squad. Tyreek Hill said that Eric Bieniemy was a great coach. And there have been plenty of other players who said a lot of great things about Eric Bieniemy. Andy Reid isn't the nicest guy in the world. People seem to forget that Andy Reid cusses his players out. So with Eric Bieniemy, I don't think that this is something that's going to keep the Commanders from being able to overachieve this year. I still have them at 9-8. This is kind of what I expected. I was waiting for when we were actually going to get a story about Eric Bieniemy and his coaching style. I saw a clip on TikTok a couple of months ago about Eric Bieniemy when he was snapping on Adrian Peterson for being late to practice. And Adrian Peterson said that he got held back by the training staff because they were taking a long time to tape him up. But Eric Bieniemy was like, nah, he isn't trying to hear that. You know, be accountable. Show up a little bit earlier so you can get the practice on time. Accountability is something that a lot of the younger generation doesn't do a good job at doing. And when you have these old school coaches, a lot of these newer players kind of are a little bit soft. And I'm not saying that in a demeaning, condescending way, but I'm just telling it how it is. Somebody who's played high school football with a lot of people my age and, you know, talking to a lot of people my age who have played football, I'm going to just keep it 100 with you. There aren't a lot of young people around the age of 20 and whatnot who are able to take this kind of coaching. And it shows a lot more about the players than it does the coach. Now, coaches do have to be able to adapt, but Ron Rivera has said that Eric Bieniemy hasn't been doing anything too crazy. He's not making people do 100 sprints up and down the field after practice for missing an assignment or anything. It's just that he's really intense. There's a sense of urgency with Eric Bieniemy, and Eric Bieniemy knows that if he doesn't do his job well, guess what happens? He gets fired, which is why he has that fire, which is why there's always a sense of urgency. He has a different tone in his voice compared to most coaches. If you have a coach like Eric Bieniemy on your staff, you already should understand that there are going to be players who may be a little bit turned off to his coaching, but at the end of the day, it's one team, one goal. If you want to win as a player, you have to be able to buy into your coach. And if a coach can't get you to buy in, then that kind of falls a little bit not just on the coach, but on the player as well. The players have to believe in the coach, and they have to at least give him a shot. You can't be turned off on the guy because he coaches you up too hard. He has a job to do. Not everybody goes about coaching in the same way. That's why everybody has their own distinct style that works and doesn't work. Bill Belichick's style works when you're able to win. That's why he was able to get guys to come to New England, and he didn't really have too many clashes with players because players already knew what they were getting into when they were going to New England. With Eric Bieniemy, he's on a franchise that hasn't had a lot of success in over the last 2 decades and hasn't had a strong structure from an organization standpoint, starting all the way from the top. Eric Bieniemy's trying to get things cleaned up. He's trying to get things lined up in order so they can go out and execute. So I don't think that this is a big deal that a lot of people are making it out to be. Anybody who has ever played football should have at least had 1 or 2 coaches, maybe not the head coach, but at least your defensive coordinator, your offensive coordinator that was really tough on you, that was always yelling, always getting in your face. Hell, when I was in high school playing ball, I had plenty of teammates who were bulking up the coaches because players were feeling a little bit disrespected with how they came at them. And I kind of feel like the players were a little bit in their feelings. You know, some players, when they get yelled at and screamed at by a coach, they kind of get in their feelings a little bit. They get their feelings hurt and they take it personal. This isn't personal. This is business. This is a performance-based business. I tell you guys this all the time. And if you don't perform, guess what happens? People lose their jobs. Eric Bieniemy has a family to provide for. He has to put food on the table. So he goes about coaching the best way he knows how. And even though he hasn't gotten a head coaching job, I don't think this is the reason for him not having one. I just think that these players need to get a little bit used to having a guy like Eric Bieniemy as their head coach. Like I said, I don't get why this is such a big story. Everybody who's played football on some level, from Pop Warner to high school ball, has at least had a coach like Eric Bieniemy that was ultra intense and always kind of getting at his players. And some of these coaches are pretty good, and some of these coaches have been pretty awful. So you guys let me know down in the comment section if you think that this Eric Bieniemy situation is being a little bit overblown. Have you had coaches that have had a similar coaching style to Eric Bieniemy, or do you think that Eric Bieniemy kind of needs to loosen up a little bit if Washington wants to have success? Hell, Tom Coughlin was super intense. He's probably the most intense coach in the history of the league, and he won 2 championships. Although he had to ease up a couple of times, I mean, he was still an ultra-intense guy, a guy about structure, a guy about discipline. And I think the guys who are about structure and discipline normally tend to be pretty good head coaches, as long as they don't over-D on it and, go about it in a way that just gets their players to despise them. You still have to be personable. It's not all about, yelling at guys just to yell at them. You have to yell at guys for a reason. When you're yelling at guys, you do it to get them to respond. And a lot of these younger age players that are starting to enter the league, they can't take this kind of coaching. They can't handle old school style coaching because they get into their feelings. And those players normally tend not to be that good, because anytime you have a player that gets in his feelings over hard coaching, he's going to get into his feelings when he ends up making the wrong decision on a play or things are going wrong. These are the kind of players that you don't want on your team. So if anything, all the players that have went up to Ron Rivera and complained about Eric Bieniemy, I think he kind of should be looking at them with the people's eyebrow and kind of trying to evaluate where they lie with this team. Now, if it's some of your star players, okay, but even then, it's just some of these younger players, they just can't handle the kinds of coaches that Eric Bieniemy is. Players can't handle being yelled at. They can't handle being overly criticized. This is coming from somebody that's in my 20s and has played with a lot of these newer age football players, man. They just can't handle this kind of coaching. But the ones that do end up being really great. You can't let these kinds of things affect you, man. It's a mental game as well. For coaches getting on you, that should motivate you to play harder, not getting your feelings. There are players that really can't handle Eric Bieniemy kind of coach because they just don't have it. And some players, they can handle these kinds of coaches. But for an organization like the Washington Commanders, you need an Eric Bieniemy. You need an authority figure. You need somebody who's going to come in and lay down the law. Say, no, this is how we're going to do things, and I want it done my way, and have a certain tone about it. Eric Bieniemy is a tone setter. So I'm not overly concerned about this. I think the Washington Commanders are still going to be a playoff team. A lot of people are sleeping on Washington, but I'm wide awake on them, and I hope that you guys start catching on. And I'm glad that Eric Bieniemy is finally being talked about. There are people who don't even know that Eric Bieniemy is the offensive coordinator for the Commanders. So that just tells you everything that you need to know about how people evaluate teams. They just evaluate teams based on what they have on the depth chart and talent, but coaching also matters as well. I was listening to Colin Cowherd the other day, and he said that conference realignment is good for the sport because there has been a shortage of great games in college football over the last couple of years. And with these new super conferences that are starting to form in the Big Ten and the SEC, that's going to lead to more great games being played. And I think that is a pretty solid point. I do get tired of seeing schools like Alabama playing against Kennesaw State and paying FCS teams to blow them out. But I don't think that college football has an overall shortage of great games or marquee matchups. I think there are a lot of great games that have been played over the last couple of years, but nobody really talks about them unless they are games that have a big impact on the college football playoff picture. Last year, Washington and Oregon State played at one of the best games of the college football season, and nobody really talked about it. It was a very phenomenal game. Everybody only paid attention to the games that had playoff impact. And that's the problem with college football right now. I don't think college football has a shortage of great games. Colin Cowherd in that segment, he said that the only games that have him the most intrigued is Colorado, TCU, and LSU versus FSU, but there are other great week 1 matchups like Florida versus Utah. That game has very big implications. Florida is a team that nobody expects to be that good this year, so if they could go on the road and pull off a big upset win against Utah, do you know how much momentum they would have to start the season? That would be a season-altering win if Florida was able to pull off that victory early in the season. What about Duke and Clemson? Nobody's talking about Duke and Clemson because nobody views Duke as a legitimate playoff contender. And even though Duke isn't one of those teams that probably is going to be in the playoff conversation, they're a team that's going to be really good this year. They had a new head coach last year and they won 9 games with them. And they very well could pull off the upset about Clemson. What about Nebraska, Minnesota? Matt Rule making his Nebraska debut. UNC versus South Carolina. You got 2 Carolina programs facing off week 1 in a rivalry matchup. Drake May versus Spencer Rattler. I mean, come on. You mean to tell me that these aren't games that don't really have a lot of excitement? And here's the thing. Let's say college football had about 10 great games or 10 big games every single weekend, right? How would you be able to watch them all when most of the times you'll have several great games or big games on at the same time? You look on ESPN at 3:30 p.m. and there's the SEC Game of the Week on ESPN and also the SEC Game of the Week on CBS. You know, like, college football doesn't do a great job at spacing out their big games. You can't have several big games in the same window because you're going to split your audience. I can't watch 4 games at one time. Well, you can if you got the ESPN app and you use a little split screen thing, but still, most people like to watch 1 game at a time. Somebody like me who pays attention to 5 games at one time, it kind of makes it hard to keep up with everything, take everything in. The coverage of the college football playoffs has been the biggest reason why a lot of games that used to be viewed as big in the past have started to lose their meaning. Rivalry games have kind of lost their luster. I don't feel like the Iron Bowl hits the same anymore like it used to be. The Iron Bowl has been a classic the last couple of years, and what's made the Iron Bowl so appealing is that even though Alabama is always so dominant, you wonder if Auburn's going to be able to hang in like how they did a couple of years ago when they took Alabama to 4 overtime periods on a down year. You know, there are plenty of great games that get played in college football every single week. You just can't look at the Georgias and Alabamas of the world and say there's not a lot of great games because those teams are playing FBS opponents. Find teams that are playing against great competition then. There's always great games. You see, a great game isn't always defined by who's the most highest ranked or who has the best storylines. People are intrigued with TCU Colorado because of Deion Sanders being there. But let's face it, if Deion Sanders wasn't at Colorado, why would that game have any national intrigue? Honestly, you're kind of watching that game because of Coach Prime. I wouldn't really include that on my list of great games to watch for week 1 of the college football season, man, because Colorado, this is a program that only won 1 game last year. TCU is coming off a college football playoff berth. So therefore, I wouldn't consider that a great game. And the last time I checked the odds, TCU was favored to beat Colorado by at least 19 points. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying you could look at that game and say that's not a great game. But you have intrigue in that because of Deion Sanders, because of the storylines. And you could make any college football game a potential great game by just looking at the storylines. And you just can't decide if a game is going to be great or not by just looking at the teams who are going to be playing in it, because you have a team that's really good end up in a close game against a team that isn't also great. Georgia was in some dogfights last season with Missouri and Kent State. Those were pretty good games, and you wouldn't have thought, because when you see Georgia, Kent State on the schedule, you think it's going to be a one-sided affair. You see, one thing that makes college football so great compared to the NFL is that Any given Saturday, you're capable of seeing a big upset. And you can see upsets in the NFL, but I don't think upsets hit the same in the NFL as they do in college football. When Tennessee pulled off the upset against Alabama, it just felt different. It was just a different atmosphere. You know, the fans just acted differently. They acted like Tennessee won the damn national championship when they upset Alabama. Meanwhile, if you see an upset in the NFL, you know, it's like you get a little excited about it, but after a couple of days, like it's on the next week. People are still talking about Tennessee's upset over Alabama to this day. And, you know, somebody in the comment section said that they need a red zone type channel for college football where they show you every game red zone play. They do. You see, like, the problem with college football is just that there are so many games out there that the ones that have a lot of appeal, they end up being in the same time slot as other marquee matchups. So it kind of splits your attention. And for the night games, the 8 p.m. games that get played on ABC in prime time, you also have other good games being played in that same time slot or an hour later on Fox. So college football has to do a better job at, you know, marketing and emphasizing their marquee matchups. You know, don't have a lot of great teams playing big games at the same time. Try to space them out a little bit so you don't split your audience and everybody can just key in on one game. Like, the one reason why I love watching Ohio State and Michigan play so much is because they play early in the day at 12 o'clock and no other big time rivalry games were getting played at that time. So you look at the game, even if it didn't have college football ramifications or college football playoff ramifications, people would still tune in, people would still watch it because people are drawn towards Michigan and Ohio State. People have made college football too much about the playoffs and not enough about the individual matchups anymore. What about the rivalries? What about Oregon State and Oregon? That was a great game. That was one of the best games of the college football season last year, and nobody talked about it because the only team that had something to lose in many people's eyes was Oregon because they were in the college football playoff race. But nobody talked about how Oregon State was on pace to have their first 10-win seasons in years. You feel me? Like, we kind of have made college football all about the playoffs, and that's why a lot of these games have lost their luster because you're only intrigued to the games that are going to impact how the playoff picture looks. We need to make these rivalry games go back to actually meaning something. We need to put more coverage on games that may not have college football playoff teams, but at least two teams that potentially could make it to a New Year's Six bowl game or a team that's competing for their first 10-win season in years. You know, like, I don't think there's a shortage of great games in college football. There have been plenty of great games played. Hell, last year, Kansas versus Oklahoma was a pretty good game. What about TCU versus Texas? Hell, any game that TCU played in last year seemed to be a classic. So I think there are a lot of great games that are on every single week. You just can't say, oh, like, this isn't a great game because it doesn't excite you. You have to actually see how the game plays out first. Because I promise you, if you watch Texas A&M and Appalachian State, you were pretty glued to that game because you wanted to see if Appalachian State was going to be able to pull off the upset against Texas A&M. Same thing with Marshall against Notre Dame. We were thunderstruck when Marshall upset Notre Dame the way they did. You see, great games aren't tied to a brand or a team, and it's not tied to college football playoff implications. Great games are just, are you going to have a game that comes down to the wire? You know, Colin Cowherd said that there's more great games during the NFL season than there are college football. Guess what? College football is not the NFL. In the NFL, every game matters. Because there's so many teams in the playoff, and teams are trying to win their divisions or trying to position themselves with a good enough record that they are good enough to get into the playoffs without having to win their division. When you look at college football, though, what makes college football tick isn't the same thing that makes the NFL tick. What makes college football tick is the fandom. You know, certain games may not mean a lot to you, But to the fan base, it means everything. The Civil War between Oregon State and Oregon may not mean a lot to somebody from the East Coast, but it means a lot to those two fan bases and the alumni of their schools. You can't judge how great a game is going to be by looking at it on the schedule and then just assuming that it isn't going to mean anything. The same people who say that college football has a great game shortage are the same people who make it all about the college football playoffs and then have the nerve to go on Twitter and say how these bowl games are meaningless. No, these bowl games ain't meaningless, fam. These bowl games are meaningless to you. I love bowl season. I love the fact that during the middle of December, I can turn my TV on and see a bowl game being played at 6 p.m. in the middle of Thursday or in the middle of the week on Wednesday. I love bowl season. I love watching the Dollar General Bowl, the Duke Mayo Bowl, the Sun Bowl, the Tony the Tiger Stripes Bowl. You feel me? I'm just a fan of college football. And if you're a fan of college football, you're just somebody who just enjoys watching the games overall, not just watching the teams that always have playoff implications on the line, because that's not what this sport has been about. What has made college football so popular has been the pageantry, the fan base, the intensity, you know, the feeling that you get when your favorite team pulls off an upset. And we've lost that luster. It doesn't hit the same anymore. I remember when Boise State was able to upset Georgia and Virginia Tech early in the season. You know, that's what makes college football special. You know, the upsets, the different kinds of fan bases. It's not always about the college football playoffs. It's not the end-all, be-all. And that's why people like Colin Cowherd come on and say there's a shortage of great games, because they only pay attention to the games that either have a mega big storyline like Deion Sanders or have two teams competing for the college football playoffs. The two games that Colin Cowherd said interest him the most were TCU, Colorado, and LSU, FSU. And ironically, they just fit both of the narratives that I described. People watch college football games on a national level who only make it about the college football playoffs, only care about games that have mega big storylines, a coach on the hot seat, or a big name coach like Deion Sanders. How are they going to fare? Or a team that has college football implications on the line, or both teams have college football playoff hopes on the line, such as FSU and LSU. You know, there are other great games that are going to be played week one that are going to have the potential to be really good. Utah, Florida could be a classic. Duke, Clemson could be a classic. UNC, South Carolina could be a classic. These all have the capability of being able to be great games. Just because Alabama and a lot of big name schools play some jabronis on a couple of occasions, or Michigan's case nearly every single week, doesn't mean that college football has a big game shortage. Even with you expanding the conferences and adding more teams to the Big Ten, there are still going to be matchups that nobody cares about. Let's just be honest. Nobody gives a damn about watching Purdue and Northwestern. Nobody's going to watch Purdue versus Nebraska as much as they're going to watch Michigan versus Ohio State. Same thing anytime Vanderbilt plays anybody. Nobody's tuning in for a game featuring Vanderbilt. That happens with any conference. Regardless how many teams you add to said conference, there are always going to be some games that are going to be washes. Because not every team in every conference is going to be good. There are just going to be some schools who are going to be the bottom of the barrel. And that's just what it is. You're just going to have some games that just don't have great teams. That doesn't mean there's a great game shortage in college football. I mean, you look at these SEC schools, yeah, they do schedule jabronis and it does upset you. But I mean, let's not act like there aren't a lot of other games being played. People tried to say that Georgia played an easy schedule last year and just forget the fact that they played Oregon week one and embarrassed them and clapped them. And Oregon was a really good team. We forget about Tennessee versus Pitt. That was a classic. Utah versus Florida last year was a classic. But I didn't hear nobody bringing up how great those games were because college football playoff implications weren't on the line. The Big Ten plays at Numa because they have, you see, with college football, there has to be a better way at scheduling these marquee matchups in a way that they don't undermine each other. You can't have some of your biggest games of the afternoon being played in the same time slot. I can't be watching the Iron Bowl at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, for example, and watching the game between Ohio State and Michigan being played at the same time. You need to spread out your games. Make one big game be played at noon. Make another marquee matchup be played a little bit later in the day. Don't have all these great games on at the same time. And I know there are so many college football teams and there's so many games that get played that you're going to have some overlapping ones, but make your marquee matchups noticeable. Don't have a 1 versus 5 team going up against a 3 versus 10 team at the same time. You know, like, there are plenty of great games. It's just that the games that really get the most attention are the ones that have games featuring playoff teams. And college football isn't all about the college football playoffs. There are other reasons for why games can be good, why games have meaning. And like I said, you can't judge how great a game is going to be based on how it looks on paper. I got to get a sip of water before I move on. If you haven't already, make sure that you leave a like, subscribe to the channel. We go live every day, Monday through Friday, around 5 p.m. Eastern time. Listen to the audio version of the JT Sports Podcast. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. You can find the JT Sports Podcast. All right, now let's segue to this. Florida going on the road to take on Utah. This is the second time that these two teams are going to be matching up against each other over the last 2 years. We saw last year's game ended up resulting in a classic, and I think that this year, the game could go a similar way. Utah is a 7.5-point favorite right now, and talking to a lot of people, there's a sentiment out there that Utah probably is going to run away with this game. And I don't know if I can share that same opinion. I do get that there is a lot of skepticism about Graham Mertz being the starting quarterback for Florida this year. But one thing that you got to understand about Florida is that they're not going to overly rely on Graham Mertz to win games. As a matter of fact, the key to Florida having a successful season is going to be how good they're going to be able to run the football in this matchup. And Utah is a team that's very physical, very good running the football. They got a very good offensive line, and they're very good against the run themselves. And they also have a really good defensive line. And for Florida, your offensive line is a little bit of a question. Not a huge concern, but you do have a couple of guys that you're going to have to replace. I think you did a very good job at filling the holes that you had on the offensive line via the transfer portal. You got some guys who are going to be able to step up for you. For Utah, last year, they lost because Anthony Richardson was just looking like a superstar out there. He just had one of those superstar kind of performances that anytime Florida was in a hole, Anthony Richardson would make a play and dig Florida out of it. And Cam Rising threw the game-sealing interception in the red zone that pretty much sealed the win for the Gators. And Utah, you know they're looking for some revenge. And I want to see how Utah's home crowd is going to affect Florida, because last year, Florida's home crowd was a big impact or had a big factor in how last year's matchup went. I mean, Utah had a pretty difficult time getting the play calls in. There were a couple of pre-snap penalties. So I wonder if the Utah crowd is going to have the same effect on Florida, the same way Florida's home crowd had on the Utes last year. Now, you look at how talented both of the running back positions are for Florida and Utah. Florida has one of the best running back duos, not just in the SEC, but in the whole entire country, with Trevor Etienne, the younger brother of Travis Etienne, and Montrell Johnson. Trevor Etienne was one of the best true freshman running backs in college football last year. You look at Montrell Johnson, he followed Billy Napier from Louisiana. They have a really good running back tandem. Utah, they got a three-headed attack at running back. You got Jaquindon Jackson, Michael Bernard, and Jalen Glover, who I'm really excited to see play this year. So both of these teams have really good stables of running backs. And they're going to be really good when it comes to having a good time running the football this season. But who's going to have the better run defense? Now, Utah, you probably have a little bit more confidence that they're going to perform better against the run this year compared to Florida because their defensive line is a little bit more proven. And plus, Florida's going to have a new defensive coordinator in Austin Armstrong. But Florida's defensive line is really good. Not only do they have a lot of talent, but they have a lot of depth at that position. They probably are 7 to 8 deep on their defensive line. That's probably their strongest, deepest part of their defense. And they're going to be able to rotate in a lot of guys, keep guys fresh. And I think that Florida matches up very well against Utah against the run this year. I do know that Florida's run defense was 95th in America last year, but that's last year. Florida has a new defensive coordinator. Austin Armstrong is one of the youngest defensive coordinators in the Power 5 for a reason. His defense at Southern Miss was absolutely outstanding. And bringing this to Florida, the problem with Florida is that they didn't lack talent on defense. They just didn't have the proper head coach who's been able to get the most out of this defense. And it was the same problem when they had Dan Mullen as their head coach previously, with Todd Grantham serving as their defensive coordinator. So Austin Armstrong should be able to get Florida's defense playing at a way higher level. And if this defense ends up improving and we see that improvement on the defensive side of the football from Austin Armstrong in this game, it's going to keep this thing close and it's going to keep it tight. And for everybody that is concerned about how Florida's passing game is going to be against Utah's defense, we need to pay a little bit of attention to Utah's passing game against Florida's defense. They do have Cam Rising, one of the best quarterbacks in the Pac-12, one of the more better quarterbacks overall in all of college football, but his weapons that he's going to be throwing to this year is really shaky. Your best receiver is Devin Leary, and Utah fans aren't really the highest on him. And this isn't coming from me. This is coming from Utah Utes fans themselves, who said that Leary is an okay receiver, but he's not a true number one. Now, you do have Brent Keithy coming back fully healthy, and he was one of the better tight ends in all of college football. And if you remember Dalton Kincaid, you probably should remember Brent Keithy because he was just as good as what Dalton Kincaid was. It's just that Dalton Kincaid was a more traditional tight end. He had the more prototypical size that you expect from somebody playing that position. Meanwhile, Brent Keithy, he's more of a slot receiver playing the tight end position. And Brent Keithy, I think he's going to have a big role in this offense, in this game. They're going to be targeting him really heavily. And if Florida can find a way to limit Brent Keithy's effectiveness in this passing attack and force Cam Rising to have to find guys like Devin Leary and the other receivers that are on Utah's offense, I think they could cause Utah's offense or their passing attack to struggle a little bit. I think Cam Rising is a really good quarterback, but in big games, I don't think he always plays the cleanest football. As a matter of fact, in some of Utah's biggest games last year, like against UCLA, I don't think he played all that well. So I think when you look at Cam Rising in this game, if you can eliminate Brent Keithy early, I think it kind of puts a little bit more pressure on him. I don't know how good your pass rush is going to be this year. I do think that you're going to have a really good run defense. I don't know what to expect from the pass rush. And going against the offensive line that Utah has is going to test out just how good that pass rush is going to be this year. Now, for Florida offensively, let's say Utah, worst case scenario, is able to slow down the run game of Florida. And let's say this becomes a game where Graham Mertz has to win it for Florida through the air. Well, you do have Pretty Ricky. You got Marcus Burke. I don't think that Florida's lacking in talent at wide receiver or when it comes to their group of pass catchers. I just think that you have a lot of unproven guys. But going against Utah secondary, statistically, Utah had a very good defense. But if you watch Utah play last season, you would know that this defense had a tendency to give up a lot of big plays and bunches at times. And Florida, even though they may not have a lot of proven talent, I think that they do have a good amount of speed and athleticism at wide receiver. And when you look at a guy like Marcus Burke, with the kind of size and length that he has, if you're Graham Mertz, you can find him on some 50-50 balls, try to see if you can get him to come down with some contested catches. I think Florida's going to have to try to stretch the field on Utah's defense. I don't think Florida's passing attack is going to find success just running simplistic short routes and checkdowns all game. You're going to have to stretch the field if you're Billy Napier. And I think they are going to have the ability to do that with how inconsistent Utah's secondary was at times last year. And Utah has a very good defense overall. But I don't think that this defense is good enough that they're just going to shut down Florida's offense completely and they're going to hold Florida to 10 points. And I'm wondering who's going to be able to really take control of this game, because both of these teams have the same kind of philosophy. They want to be physical, they want to run the football down your throat, and they also want to play smothering defense. Who's going to be able to accomplish those keys? So even though I think that Utah probably is going to win this game because they are playing this game at home, I do think that this probably should be a pretty close game. I don't know if Utah covers the 7.5. I probably would take Florida with the under. Even though Utah has the more talented roster, I don't think it's by all that much. Florida does recruit pretty well. Utah may be ahead of them in some positions, but this is week 1 of the season. And the best time for games to be very close, when you have a game that kind of looks a little one-sided on paper, is that teams tend to come out a little bit rusty. And around this time last year, there were people who thought that Utah was a sure thing to beat Florida, and we saw how that game went with Anthony Richardson. This year, you're not going to have Anthony Richardson to bail you out, but you are going to be a team that's going to be less dependent on the big play backyard football ability of Anthony Richardson, which is why you could be a little bit excited for Graham Mertz. And I think as long as Florida can keep their run game going in this game and they don't find themselves down multiple possessions, I think they're going to have a good shot at winning this thing. Now, is this game going to be a potential Florida W? I doubt it. I still expect Utah to pull off the win because they're playing at home. They got the better team. But with this being a week 1 matchup and teams in week 1 kind of starting out a little bit slow, a little bit rusty, you typically see more mistakes and more turnovers early in the season versus later on during the season when teams start to get a little bit more comfortable. They start to get a little bit more locked in. So I think there are some advantages that do play in Florida's favor. I don't think they're going to get dog walked in this game, and I'm looking forward to seeing how Graham Mertz looks making his Florida Gators debut, because, you know, he wasn't really a good quarterback when he was playing for Wisconsin, and maybe him changing schools could be what he needs to jumpstart his career. We saw what happened with Bo Nix, Michael Penix. They weren't good with their previous programs, and then they transferred to 2 schools in the Pac-12, and now they're Heisman favorites this season. I think Kentucky is the most underrated team in the SEC going into this season. I don't think enough people are talking about Kentucky this year. And I did a poll on my channel asking who you guys thought was going to be the second best team in the East behind Georgia this year. And the majority of you guys voted Tennessee. A good majority of you guys behind Tennessee voted South Carolina. And then Kentucky was not even really receiving too many votes. And I think that a lot of y'all really sleeping on how good the Wildcats are going to be this year. I know things were really disappointing for them last season. Remember, going into 2022, they were coming off a 10-3 season in 2021, but they lost their offensive coordinator, Liam Cohen, who went to the Rams for a season. He's back, and Will Levis regressed. And Will Levis, now that he's gone, you're going to have Devin Leary replacing him. And Devin Leary is a huge upgrade over Will Levis. Not only is he a better decision maker, than Will Levis, but he also is just a better overall quarterback than what Will Levis was. Prior to last season, Devin Leary had one of the best touchdown interception ratios in all of college football, and he was probably the best quarterback in the ACC when he was playing for NC State. He's going to Kentucky, a team that has a really talented offense. A lot of people aren't talking about how good this receiving core is for Kentucky. You got Dane Key, Barry Brown, who both played as true freshmen last year and were two of the best receivers on this team. They're going into their sophomore seasons. These weren't 3-star, 2-star guys, neither. These were 4-star recruits coming out of high school. And Kentucky's offensive line was really bad last year, which is uncharacteristic for this program because normally the offensive line for Kentucky is amongst the best in college football, and it has the nickname the Big Blue Wall. So hopefully your offensive line can bounce back to what it used to be, but even if your offensive line isn't as great as what it has been historically, your offensive line is still going to be better than South Carolina's. South Carolina's offensive line has been an issue for how many years? I don't think South Carolina is going to be better than Kentucky. I think Devin Leary is going to be better than Spencer Rattler. And Spencer Rattler, yes, he did have a good end to last year, but he just wasn't consistent. You're going to get more consistency out of your quarterback play, and having consistent quarterback play in the SEC is key. If you have a quarterback that's inconsistent, especially in big games, you are going to have a hard time being able to have a lot of success in this conference. Devin Leary, with the receivers that he's going to be throwing to, having Liam Cohen return as his offensive coordinator. Remember, when Liam Cohen was last the offensive coordinator for Kentucky, Mark Stoops had the best offense of his whole entire tenure at Kentucky when Liam Cohen was there. So he comes back and he's with Devin Leary, a better quarterback than Will Levis, who's going to make less mistakes and is going to be better at reading coverages. This offense should be one of the better units in the SEC this year. And how they compare to Tennessee offensively, I don't think they're on the same level of Tennessee. I think Tennessee's offense is going to be just as good as what it was last year. But Kentucky doesn't have the same playing style of Tennessee. They're not a team that's going to beat you by spreading the ball around. They're going to be a balanced football team. They're going to be good enough to run the football against you, and they also going to have a lot of success throwing the football against you, with them having one of the 3 best quarterbacks in this conference, and Devin Leary. Outside of Jaden Daniels, KJ Jefferson, who else are you going to put over Devin Leary? Not Spencer Rattler. Spencer Rattler hasn't been better than Devin Leary over the last 2 years, and you can't say he's been in a better situation because he was playing at NC State. I mean, Joe Milton has a lot of potential, but right now, Devin Leary is the better QB. Devin Leary gives Kentucky a good advantage as compared to the other teams in the SEC East not named Georgia. I'm looking at Kentucky's wide receiving core. I think a lot of people are sleeping on it. I think that the stigma about Kentucky football is that they're a physical team that likes to run the football. They can't do much throwing the football, and I think that's going to change this year. And this defense is going to be really good. Mark Stoops feels really confident about how good his front 7 is going to play this year. As a matter of fact, they feel that this is the most talented and the deepest that Kentucky has been on the defensive line in a very long time. And it's not about how many SEC defenses that Devin Leary has faced. There has been plenty of quarterbacks that have transferred to the SEC and had success. How many SEC defenses did Jaden Daniels face when he was playing for Arizona State? None. And he was snapping for LSU. So it's not about what conference you come from. If you're a great quarterback in one conference, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be that same quarterback unless you just forget how to play football. Joe Milton wasn't good for Michigan, and he was snapping for Tennessee. And he didn't face any SEC defenses when he was playing for Michigan. And I'm taking that Mr. Jones in the comment section happens to be a Tennessee fan, and he's strongly disagreeing with this, and I understand that. This is a really bold take, but I think that Kentucky, with them having a better defense this year, gives them the edge over Tennessee. And Tennessee's offensive playing style kind of hinders how good their defense can be, because anytime you have an offense that's as fast as Tennessee, you're going to put your defense on the field for a lot of plays. Tennessee's defense is probably on the field for 12 to 15 more plays, more as opposed to a team that runs a less faster offense or a slower paced offense. And that's going to be a huge disadvantage when you're playing against a team like Kentucky that's able to run the football and tire your defense out faster. In South Carolina, I'm not sleeping on the Beamer boys. I love the Beamer boys. I got them winning 8 games, but I don't think their offensive line is going to be as good as what Kentucky's is going to be, and their defense has some question marks also. So I think that Kentucky is a better overall team than what South Carolina is. South Carolina got their team depleted from the transfer portal. The offensive line is still a concern. They got a talent at receiver, but we don't know how consistent Spencer Rattler is going to be. And I'm not doubting Spencer Rattler. I'm just saying that he was inconsistent last year. He had a good 3-4 game stretch to end the season. Devin Leary is just a better proven, more consistent QB. Same thing with Joe Milton. I love Joe Milton, but even though I think Joe Milton is going to be a very great quarterback, I think he's going to be a Heisman finalist. Right now, I got to put my bias aside, and I have to give the advantage to Devin Leary. I think Kentucky is a better overall team than what Tennessee and South Carolina is. And that's why I think they're going to end up being the second best team in the East behind Georgia. You look at their schedule, I think they can be able to win 10 games. They probably won't be able to beat Alabama. Alabama probably will win that game. But I think outside of that game, everybody else that Kentucky plays is pretty beatable. Even Georgia. You look at the teams that have given Georgia some of their toughest games over the last couple of years in the East, it's been Kentucky. Even though Kentucky isn't a team that is normally great offensively, their defense is really good, and this is one of those teams that they're very physical. And I think this year they could give Georgia a little bit of a challenge this year now that they have a better quarterback, and if their offensive line improves, I think that Kentucky-Georgia game could be interesting, and Kentucky has the possibility of going into that game against Georgia possibly undefeated and maybe being a top 10, top 15 team heading in. So I think that a lot of people are overlooking Kentucky. They're going to have a great defense. They already have a really good defensive line with a lot of talent, a lot of depth, guys who are good against the run, guys who are good against the pass, and plenty of those guys on that defensive line are like 5 4-star guys. Their offense has a really good group of wide receivers. Dane Key and Barry Brown probably are going to be the best wide receiving duo in the conference by the end of this year. That's a bold prediction, and I'm willing to bet money on it. And you know that Kentucky normally gets pretty good production out of the running back position. The thing that has held back Kentucky has been quarterback play. Will Levis wasn't bad, but I don't think he was great. And that's why he got drafted in the second round as opposed to being a top 10 pick like many people projected him to be. I was never a big fan of Will Levis. He doesn't take care of the football, especially in big moments. I still remember that loss against Ole Miss like it was nothing. I remember when Will Levis had the ball with an opportunity to win that game, and I was just telling my roommate who I was watching the game with, I was like, watch him fold, watch him sell this game, and a couple of plays later, he ends up fumbling the football, Ole Miss recovers, and they win the game eventually. I think Devin Leary is the best quarterback that Kentucky has had in a very long time. I don't remember the last great Kentucky quarterback, but I think Devin Leary may be the best that this program has had in well over a decade. The last time Kentucky won 10 games, or they had a lot of success when they had Benny Snell, they had Terry Wilson as their starting quarterback, I believe. And he wasn't really all that great. So when you got Devin Leary, probably the best passer at the quarterback position that Kentucky has had with what they have at wide receiver, this is a very dangerous team. I'm telling you, like, the Kentucky team that you have known for over the last couple of years under Mark Stoops is not going to be the same Kentucky team that you see this year. This is going to be probably his best passing offense that he's ever had, and probably his most explosive offense ever. And this defense is going to be really good, and the offensive line should improve. I think Kentucky is probably going to be the second best team in the SEC East this year, man. Tennessee runs the ball more than they throw it. Mr. Jones in the comment section says, in the last 30 plus years, Kentucky has only beaten Tennessee twice. And I think that this year could probably be the third time in the last 30 plus years that Kentucky has beaten Tennessee. Tennessee has a really good team, but I think that a lot of people are really overlooking Kentucky this year, man. And I'm going to continue to push the narrative about Kentucky being one of the most underrated teams in college football this year. Mark Stoops is a really underrated head coach. They may not recruit at a really high level, but they do a really good job at player development and utilizing the transfer portal. So I think that Kentucky is most likely going to be the second best team in the SEC East this year behind Georgia. This is it for this episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Remember, if you haven't already, listen to the JT Sports Podcast, available on all podcasting platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. You can find the JT Sports Podcast. Rate us 5 stars if you enjoyed this episode. Type in the JT Sports Podcast, Apple, Spotify, leave a 5-star review, or go down to the description down below, and there will be the links to the Apple and Spotify versions of the podcast. Follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter, X, at JT Sports __, and on Instagram, at JT Sports _. Once again, follow us on Instagram, at JT Sports _, X, Twitter, at JT Sports __. And I appreciate you guys for tuning in to this episode of the